Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello and welcome to episode 33 of the Stark Reflections podcast. I'm your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and this week's episode is going to be a solo one where I reflect on the 2 wrongs that make a writer, or 2 wrongs that make a writer spite. I haven't decided. Maybe you can help me decide. In any case, the topic are those 2 wrongs. I'm going to take a look at 2 negative things that writers often focus on, which can be demotivating and make them hateful or spiteful. All the things that detract from what you should be focusing on to move onward and upward in your writing journey. But before I get to the main content, I'm going to share a few quick personal updates and also wanted to first share a message from this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by the listeners and patron supporters of the podcast. Thank you for being a listener, and thanks especially to the Patreon supporters whose patronage and support helps pay for my time in producing this weekly show. Thanks as well to those of you who took the time to fill out the survey that I revealed a few weeks ago, letting me know what you like, what you value, and what you don't like so much about the show. I'll be using this feedback to help to continue to bring you the value you seek and to improve upon the other bits that you've shared that aren't working as well. The survey is still open. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes so you can actually answer the survey. The survey, which appears at markleslie.ca/starksurvey, will still be open for years to come. So even if you're listening to this episode later on and you hear about the survey, go ahead and fill out the survey. I'll always be paying attention to what my listeners find valuable. Now, you can continue to support the show by A, continuing to listen to it, B, sharing it with someone you think would get value from it, C, becoming a Patreon supporter for as little as $1 a month and getting access to extra content, D, leaving a review on the podcatcher of your choice, E, filling out my podcast survey that I just mentioned to help me with feedback, or F, leaving a comment and interacting where applicable. You see, I'm all about the options. I've also come up with a nickname for listeners of the show because, well, listeners just feels a bit cold and feels a little bit generic, and you're so much more than listeners. If you're continuing to listen to this podcast, then that alone is a type of engagement that I value incredibly, even if we haven't actually interacted. So I've decided upon the name Reflectives as a synonym for those who listen to this show, because I imagine that you aren't just listening. You're listening and then you're reflecting upon and adapting the things that you hear and what you hear makes you think about into your own writer journey. I imagine that you're a little bit like me in that respect. I listen to plenty of podcasts and I don't just consume the content, I reflect upon it and I consider how I might adapt that into my own writer life. You, my ideal listener, are quite similar. You want insight, you want transparency, you want stark and realistic sharing of what it's like for the average author. You want to listen to conversations with other writers, both experienced and seasoned writers like you, but also beginning and just starting writers like you. Because regardless of where you are on your writer journey, you recognize that there is always something to learn, not only from publishing insiders and writers with decades of experience, but also from those who are at just the beginning of their own writing and publishing journey. You respect that everyone brings value or nobody brings value. Sorry, I couldn't help but riffing on the Harry Bosch mantra from Michael Connelly's novels where everybody counts or nobody counts. But I really do feel that way. Everybody has something to contribute, no matter where you are in your writer journey. I believe that, and I believe that as a reflective, as a listener to this podcast, you believe that too. You want integrity and to cut through the BS, the finger pointing, and the sky is falling reaction that creative types like you and me can be quite prone to. You enjoy speculative musings, but you appreciate when someone shares their personal experience and reveals the limit of their knowledge or experience. You also understand that by default, people tend to only share the extremes. That, yes, you can make millions from writing, or that writing means you'll always be poor on that other extreme. But you understand and appreciate that outside of those extremes, there are thousands of shades of in between, and that most of us move through these elements and through these shades over the course of our writing career. One day, 1 week, 1 month we're on top of the world, another, the world is rolling over top of us. Sure, you're interested in the grand riches and the wealth and the fame and the fortune that are possible, but you want to be 100% realistic about the hard work, the professionalism, and the dedication and commitment not only to the craft of writing, but to understanding the business of writing and publishing. You don't just want the sizzle, you want the whole steak, the tender and juicy, delicious flavor, but you recognize that there's also a bone that you might break your teeth on, not to mention the ripples of fat and gristle that exist in the meat. This isn't some cartoon steak, it's a real one, as juicy and delicious as you imagine, but it's also a real steak with the good pieces and the other parts that give it rich and unique texture. Okay, I've gone on enough with the steak analogy because it's making me hungry. And I might even apologize to vegetarians and vegans, but I know that you are keen enough to adapt that analogy into your own favorite consumable, because that's part of being a reflective. Thank you for being a reflective and continuing to listen to this podcast. Okay, so now time for a bit of a personal update. This week I'm traveling to Calgary to be part of the When Words Collide conference in Calgary. I'll be doing several presentations and sitting on a few panels while I'm here, and I'm actually recording this in my hotel room at the Delta, Calgary South, where When Words Collide takes place. My presentations here will, of course, involve understanding the business of writing and publishing, the book-selling landscape in general, pitfalls that writers often fall prey to, as well as the business of writing and selling ghost stories. I'll also be doing a very special Free Friday Frights live event in front of an audience on Friday night at 9 p.m. Mountain / Calgary time, or 11 p.m. Eastern / New York / Toronto time. If you're listening to this late Thursday or early Friday, perhaps you'll catch it live. Otherwise, there's always the replay on my author Facebook page, as well as my YouTube channel, and I'll leave links to those in the show notes for this episode. If you follow my Stark Publishing page on Facebook, you might see some of the on-the-spot live interviews with folks I interact with while I'm here in Calgary. Some of those short hallway conversations or post-panel conversations may get repurposed into this podcast at a later date, and if I'm lucky, I might be able to get a full interview with some people here for a future episode. In terms of other personal updates, I'm still experimenting with my recently added author direct page from Findaway Voices so I can sell audiobooks directly. And I've also started to take advantage of the sell direct option that BookFunnel offers to authors. Now, I've been using BookFunnel for the free ebook giveaway for my author mailing list, but I realized I wasn't properly leveraging that. I walked through the process this week of setting up a single title, Evasion, on my author website at markleslie.ca, and I had to link from the book cover on the books/bibliography page to a standalone page for the book that has links to all the retailers, and I use Draft2Digital's books2read.com free tool for that. So there's a single link, and then the consumer can choose what retailer they want to go to. And if they've used it before, it automatically directs them to the retailer of their choice, so it does become single link. The more authors who use it, the more consumers who use those links, those cookies get stored, and it saves the time to make it more convenient for the consumer end. But it also makes it convenient for the writer because I only have to produce a single link rather than, and here's the link to Amazon.com, and here's the link to Kobo, and here's the link to iBooks, etc., etc., etc. I also on that page have links to the audiobook. So I have the audiobook on Audible and Kobo, and then the buy direct option via Authors Direct from Findaway Voices, and then the buy ebook direct link via BookFunnel. Now, BookFunnel's step-by-step process for this was virtually foolproof and perfect for a simple person like me to actually be able to figure it out. But it did take me some time. So far, because I haven't yet budgeted time for it, I only have the one book done, but it's a step in the right direction. And you can check it out if you want at markleslie.ca/evasion just to see what it looks like. Now, speaking of BookFunnel, I'm actually hoping to have Damon Courtney, the creator of BookFunnel, on to a special episode to talk through how to leverage and take advantage of their amazing author-friendly services. Because every time you turn around, BookFunnel's offering something new, like the recently added ability to use BookFunnel to sell ebooks using printed cards with BookFunnel codes on them. And yes, something else I need to invest some time in testing, particularly since I do a number of live author events, and it's extremely challenging to sell digital products in an analog world. So BookFunnel offers yet another tool that makes that easier for authors to do that. But that's enough of a personal update. Let's move on to the show's main topic. 2 wrongs that make a writer spite. Writers have a difficult time. First, there are these ideas, these characters, these situations, these worlds swirling around in our heads. There are often far too many of them than we could ever be able to capture down on the printed page or digital page, or however we get those words, those stories, those narratives down. But on top of that, we're either juggling full or part-time work, commitments with family, friends, and colleagues, and the ongoing struggle with placing the proper amount of priority on getting the butt in chair and the fingers on keyboard. That alone, just the creation aspect of writing, is a tremendous feat in and of itself. It's an uphill battle. But even for those for whom the words flow like free beer at a frat keg party, the whole other step of preparing the work for release, whether it's to an agent or publisher, or also more DIY self-publishing or indie publishing approach, is another uphill climb. There is so much to learn, so many mistakes to make along the way. And then the third giant pain point in this unholy trinity of the writer's angst is the selling, the marketing of the product. There are 3 hills, 3 battles, 3 struggles that we usually are always facing. So why then do we insist on piling something more on to make our burden worse? And yet we do. And we do it so willingly and freely all the time. 2 elements in particular fill us with self-doubt, fill us with further angst, fill us with despair, fill us with hopelessness and frustration. And they can be so powerful and harmful, working against us. They are comparison and rejection. And I wanted to talk a little about each of them and share my own reflections on ways that I attempt to overcome the negativity they can provide, ways that I attempt to turn these 2 negatives into a positive. First, comparison. Earlier this week, my partner Liz and I were doing our pre-workout 2K warm-up. So, we drive from our house to the Good Life Fitness in Waterloo. We check in, we deposit our gym bags, etc., into our lockers. Then we do this short run around the block to warm up. Now, the block plus a little bit of the parking lot make up about 2 kilometers. This is the perfect quick warm-up run. The run always starts with a really nice slow and gradual uphill climb, which is great for the additional challenge for us. Now, let me just take an aside to say that we aren't big-time or major experienced runners, but we enjoy running. It's great cardio for us, and for me, it's a great time to think, because it was during one of our runs this week that I started to think about this particular topic. So at the end of the run, Liz checks her Fitbit and she compares her heart rate at particular points, like the end when we tend to push a little bit harder just to get that last stretch in, or the beginning when we're running up the slow and steady slope uphill. But she's also been noting the time. And given how competitive we can be, always wanting to improve, she made a note of how long it took us to run the 2K. Now, I'm purposely not going to share how long 2K takes us because it's pretty mediocre, and focusing on the actual number isn't the point here. Some of you who run and run well will laugh at our feeble time, and others who perhaps aren't as experienced at running will feel bad about their own running and their own time and wonder how we could be so fast. That's not what the point is. The point is that we ran in a particular time. Let's call it X minutes. So before the last run we did, we said to one another, let's try to beat our last time by 10 seconds. We agreed that 10 seconds was a good goal, but we also agreed that we'd both be happy with shaving just a single second off our previous time. So X minus 1 second would be fine. Our previous time was not pushing any major envelopes, and anybody who is a seasoned runner would potentially laugh at the time we'd had. Maybe they'd be able to run 5K in the time it took us to run 2. But that wasn't the point. We had run a pace that we had been comfortable with, but we wanted to push it now to do it a little bit quicker. We didn't compare ourselves with those ultra-marathon runners who could do 2K in what felt like a heartbeat, or run a full marathon in a matter of a couple of hours. We compared ourselves to how we had done the day before. It reminds me of a phrase from a gym some friends of mine in Sudbury, Ontario attend. It's called The Basement, and I remember the slogan that they had because it was on the t-shirts that my friends had, and the slogan said, better than yesterday. A great and achievable goal where the only comparison is yourself and how you have improved. It was interesting because Liz and I had made the effort and we were measuring. We beat our time by a little more than a minute. All we were shooting for was 10 seconds, but we did much better. That was a pleasant surprise, but if we had looked at what a seasoned runner could run 2K in, we would have given up thinking we could never be that good. We could never be that quick. Instead, we focused on our best time, and we strove to beat it by just a little bit. And next time we'll look at seeing if we can at least do the same time again, or perhaps beat that by just one more second. And on and on and on. Incremental improvements, a little bit better each time. Working towards a positive goal in the right direction. Small improvements with every step. Better than yesterday. Comparing ourselves to ourselves. Bettering our best. Now I won't harp too much on how this relates to writers, because I'm sure you can see that already. But we all fall prey to this far too often. I know I'm not a top-selling author, that my books don't burn up the bestseller charts. So comparing myself to the blockbuster sellers, the Stephen Kings, the J.K. Rowlings of the world, is only going to lead to angst and despair and thinking I'll never be as good as that. I'll never have that success. Just like I'd say I could never run 2K in X amount of time like the marathon-winning runner. Similarly, comparing my sales or achievements to a best-selling indie author like Mark Dawson or Marie Force or Hugh Howey or Bella Andre or any number of the thousands of authors that I know make a killing selling ebooks is also a useless endeavor. Now I respect, admire, and I learn from these authors all the time, but I can't compare my sales to theirs. That's going to be demotivating. Instead, I compare my sales, my achievements, to my own. Yesterday, the week before, the month before, the year before. So there's this term that Joanna Penn of the brilliant The Creative Penn blog and podcast came up with for this. I interviewed Jo in episode 2 of this podcast, talking about her newest book at the time, The Healthy Writer. Now, Joanna calls this term comparisonitis. It's a great term because it's like a disease. And yes, I can even compare myself to Joanna as both a writer and, as a fellow trusted writing and publishing professional. But she is hugely successful in both, especially compared to me. Doing that would only lead to frustration. So I compare myself to myself and how I'm better today than I was yesterday. That I got one more review. I got one more subscriber to the podcast. I got one more sale of an ebook. I got one more download. I got one more follower, one more newsletter sign up than I did yesterday, last week, last month, last year. Compare yourself to the you from before. How have you improved? What have you learned? Where have you grown? It's a far more realistic and attainable thing to measure and is less likely to cripple you with that paralyzing self-doubt that happens when we fall prey to what Joanna calls, so brilliantly, comparisonitis. Compare yourself to yourself. How are you better than yesterday? The second wrong, rejection. Again, regardless of your writing and publishing journey, rejection is a part of it. Within traditional publishing, there's rejection from agents, from editors, from publishing houses, etc. You submit your work, your query, your pitch. It's accepted or rejected. If your path is about indie or self-publishing, then there's the belief that you have bypassed the gatekeepers of traditional publishing, those who would dare to reject and hold that power of rejection over you. But the reality is, you might have discovered this already, is that the slush pile you wanted to avoid in a publisher's back room is now the slush pile of an online ebook catalog. It's rejection by omission. Nobody is buying or downloading your book, or if they are, nobody is reviewing it, or if they are, they're leaving one-star reviews. They're just not getting it. Regardless of your publishing path, there's a tendency in writers towards feeling rejection. It is, after all, human to feel this. But again, earlier this week, I was reading a chapter from Carrie Flanagan's Writer's Digest book on writing and selling magazine articles, and there was a specific section on rejection that I read. Now, Carrie also talked about this in our interview in episode 31 just a couple weeks ago. But in that section of the book I'm reading, she used a great analogy, and I wanted to sort of elaborate. I'm going to take her analogy and I'm going to sort of stretch it in my own direction, but it's based on this inspiration from Carrie's great writing. Now, Carrie had said to me, and says in the book, that she hates the word rejection. It's such a harsh and final sounding word. She uses this great analogy about a waiter at a restaurant, and this is where I'm adapting it into my own a little bit. So you go to a restaurant, you have your heart set on the salmon. You've had the salmon there before, you love it. When you were hungry and decided you were going to go out to eat, you picked this particular restaurant because you adore their salmon dish. It's one of your favorites of all time. You arrive at the restaurant with 3 of your closest friends who are also very hungry. You sit down. The waiter approaches and tells you about that day's special. It's a hearty bowl of delicious chili using a meat tenderized for 48 hours in a special marinade passed on via 3 generations of the chef's family. The product for this chili is sourced locally, farm to table, with the freshest possible meat, the freshest possible vegetable ingredients, and a recipe that won no less than 3 national chili cook-off trophies. So, can I interest you in today's special? The waiter asks you after this amazingly intricate dog and pony show explanation of the special. No thank you, you say, because you're still fixated on the salmon that drew you here. Now, friend number 1 is a vegetarian and never touches meat, so she orders one of the vegetarian options on the menu. Friend number 2 pauses to say that the special sounds delicious, but it isn't really for them at this time because they are, after all, only at the restaurant because they heard you rave about the salmon, and so he wants to order the salmon exactly the way you ordered it because they want to experience that. Friend number 3, well, she just started a special diet, so she orders a plain salad with no dressing. So the waiter leaves the table. Do you expect that the waiter is going to take that as a rejection, that they're going to take it personally? Do you think that they maybe went into the back room and started to cry because none of the 4 people that they shared this special with took them up on that offer? No, they didn't. And it might seem like a silly analogy, but I love that Carrie talked about, the waiter offering the special of the day and people not ordering it. Because I think it works, particularly if you look at the people at the table. None of them were inclined to have the chili special on that day, no matter how well prepared it was, no matter how perfect it might be for the right consumer. It's not about the chili. It's about their expectations. It's about their tastes. It's about their diets. It's about their allergies. It's about their own preferences that they walked into that restaurant with. You're the waiter. Your book is today's special. The agent, the editor, the consumer, they're all the people sitting around that table. You aren't being personally rejected. It's a matter of your work not being in front of the right audience, the right consumers, the right patrons at the right time. For traditionally pitching and selling, that means the editor or agent wasn't interested in this one thing. Not that they weren't interested in you. I mean, unless you pulled a really dick move and did something to make them hate you personally. But chances are it was just about the story you wrote or pitched. And people not buying or not reviewing or offering a 1-star review of your book or something like that isn't a rejection of you. It's an acknowledgement that they aren't the target audience for that work. The key is to look at what you might be tempted to call rejection and see it from the perspective of the person on the rejecting end, and I use rejecting in quotes, to see that it's not really about that. It's not about rejection. It's about not reaching the ideal reader, the ideal target. That's a whole other conversation and a significant amount of work, i.e. defining, redefining, and staying focused on your target readers. But the first step is recognizing that these people aren't rejecting you. They're just not the right audience. That goes a long way towards removing that paralyzing self-doubt and angst. Now, I was even tempted to try to come up with another term for the word rejection that we could replace it with, thinking about using a term such as mistargeted product. But I'd rather leave that open to whatever works best for you. What I hope you get from this is that it's not about rejection. It's just not speaking to the right audience. You move on, you keep at it, and you wait for the customer who comes in hankering for that chili, because damn it, you have the world's best chili that you know they are going to love. Damn. I've been talking about steak and I'm talking about chili, and here I am out of my normal time zone in Calgary. It's mid-afternoon and I've only had breakfast, and I'm hankering for some really good Alberta beef. Something tells me that it's time for me to close off this episode before the rumbling of my stomach takes over. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that I gave you something valuable to reflect on for your own writer journey, because as I sat here reflecting, I was thinking about my own writer journey and how these things could help me. Thanks again for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre, wishing you great writing and good reflections. Let's hang out together again in episode 34 next week, shall we?
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.